All right, everybody, welcome to the third lecture of the Constitution is a Solution workshop. We're going to go ahead and get started here with the third one. It's called Constitutional Economics, Constitutional Money. I hope you've enjoyed the lectures 1 and number 2 so far. If you were not part of lectures number 1 and number 2, but you're joining us now for lecture 3, that's fine. You can always watch the previous video some other time, but you can start anywhere really. It's preferable that you start with lecture 1, but anyways, if you're just getting here, I'm glad you're here, and this is what we need to learn in order to make sure that we are constitutionalists and that we can actually get our representatives to obey the U.S. Constitution. So thank you so much for taking part in this, and I'm going to start playing the video right now.
Welcome to lecture number 3, Constitutional Economics and Constitutional Money. On the topic of constitutional economics, I figure there's really 3 lectures that could be done under this topic. Unfortunately, in this lecture series, we have time to do 1, and I feel probably the most important one. The other 2, we could go into what is true free market economics, Keynesian economic theory versus the Austrian School of Economics or free market economics. There are many good books on that topic. I'll recommend some toward the end here. But in addition to that, we could also explore the effects of government regulation and taxation and the ability to use our natural resources versus not, and how that affects our economy. But the one I feel is probably the least understood is what is constitutional money? I find that many within the freedom movement are a little bit unclear on that topic, so I feel it's a great place to begin. Now, first of all, I want to demonstrate the power of our Constitution, in particular of constitutional money. Back in 1787, when the U.S. Constitution was written, our nation was in a very dire circumstance. Our public debt was at an all-time high and growing. Our states had literally begun taking up arms against states, fighting against each other over trade disputes. We were in a serious crisis that our nation, this free experiment of self-government, was about to crumble. The nations of France and Great Britain in particular were waiting in the wings, just fully expecting that we would collapse under our own self-government, under the Articles of Confederation. We had that graph on the board, on the video, where it showed on this side 0% government anarchy, and the wedge went all the way up to 100% government tyranny on the other side. And somewhere in the middle was the proper balance of not too much government to harm the people, but enough government to protect their rights, which is where the U.S. Constitution was. The Articles of Confederation, on the other hand, were probably a little too close to the anarchy side. We had given our central government, Congress, certain tasks, certain duties that they needed to perform, and we did not give them the power to do them. For example, executing a war for our independence. They were given the obligation to run this war, to fund the war, and yet they had no taxing power. How do you fight a war without raising money to pay for the war? Well, what they ended up doing was printing money. They could ask the states, would you please send some taxes? And if the states raised more taxes than they spent, they might send some. It didn't work very well. And so they kept printing the continental dollar. And the continental dollar was so overprinted that it became worthless. Some of you might be familiar with the phrase, not worth a continental. It doesn't refer to the automobile. It refers to the money. That if you wanted to say something was totally worthless, that's not even worth a continental. It's worth less than our money, which was worthless. It gives you some idea of the circumstances of 1787. Now, George Washington here starts us off with a great quote in 1787, prior to the Constitution Convention coming together. He says, "If any person had told me that there would have been such a formidable rebellion as exists, I would have thought him fit for a madhouse." What he's saying here is, if someone had told me ahead of time that once we won our independence from Great Britain, that we would have such chaos, I would have thought he was crazy. Surely it wouldn't be that bad, but it was. Now I point this out, 1787 in September 17th, the US Constitution was signed and then sent out to the states. So that is Constitution Day, probably the most unknown holiday in our nation, Constitution Day, September 17th. Just 2 years later, 1789, we were living under the Constitution. George Washington had been sworn in now as our first president under the Constitution. From 1789 to the next quote, 1791, we have a 2-year span of living under the Constitution. Notice how different his statement becomes, just 2 years of living under the Constitution. He now says, "Tranquility reigns. Our public credit stands on that high ground, which 3 years ago, it would have been considered a species of madness to have foretold." That's kind of the same statement he said before, only in reverse now. If you had told me ahead of time how prosperous and peaceful our nation would become in just 2 years of living under the Constitution, I would have thought you're crazy. There's no way they would have ever dreamt it. To me, this is the best economic stimulus package you could design. Let's start living under the Constitution again. It did a marvelous job taking us from what was probably equally as bad as the Great Depression of the 1930s. In the 1780s, it was probably very similar. And just 2 years completely turned it around in a way they never would have dreamt. Now again, I want to go back to a quote that we used in previous lecture number 2. Thomas Jefferson giving us a guideline of how strictly we must adhere to the Constitution. He says, "To take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power, not longer susceptible of any definition." What he's saying is, if we can justify Congress taking one step outside the bounds of the Constitution, by that same justification we can justify 2 steps, and 20, and 1,000, and 1,000,000. There is nowhere to logically limit them. So as we approach constitutional money, you'll notice that we do very strictly adhere to what the Constitution actually says. And it becomes very clear what our monetary policy is supposed to be. The first question we have to ask is, what is money? You've all heard of money. You've probably all used money. Throughout the history of mankind, many different things have been used as money. Shells have been used. Cows, fish have all been used as money. Salt has been used as money. In fact, it's from the use of salt that we have the term salary and the phrase "not worth his salt," meaning not worth his pay. But what we found is that there are certain traits that are best in what we use for money. The shells tend to be a little fragile. The fish, well, you always want fresh fish, right? You can't store it and store your wealth. In fact, here's a list of 5 things. The first one is, to use something as money, it's best if it has intrinsic worth. It was already worth something before we decided to use it as money. Next, if it's divisible. A cow, for example, isn't very divisible unless you're butchering the thing. Otherwise, the moment you start butchering it, you've lost the ability to breed it or to milk it. It's not very divisible. If I have a cow and I want some eggs, I can't just cut off its tail and trade it, right? The next one, portable. It's very helpful to be able to bring your money with you to the marketplace. And if it's very heavy or voluminous, that makes it more difficult. Durability. The shells, for example, fail on that regard. You don't want to put one of those in your pocket for fear you might lean against it or sit on it. And then lastly is relative scarcity. If, for example, we were to use sand as money, the portability becomes an issue, but the relative scarcity is a big one. How many truckloads of sand would it take to buy a home? So the relative scarcity makes it so that a very small unit can be exchanged for large amounts of goods. And just naturally, without government intervention of any kind, we've naturally arrived at the precious metals as being the best fitting of these 5 conditions, gold and silver particularly. Now, question here. What is a dollar? Some of you might be familiar with what a dollar is. Does anyone have a $20 bill with them? If I were to borrow a $20 bill from you, we'll just put one up here on the board just to demonstrate. Let's say I borrow a $20 bill from you. Would it be a fair exchange for me to, instead of giving you back your 20, I give you back $1? Who's getting the better deal here? Well, the real answer is that depends on what the dollar is. Because if I give you this dollar in exchange for it, this is a silver dollar, true silver. And its current market value is quite a bit more than the $20 bill here. If you were to melt the coin down on current market, it's right around $35. Plus the coin value adds a few dollars. So you might be able to buy one of those coins for about $37, $38. So $1 is greater than 20, right? Remember those little greater than, less than questions in math? 1 is greater than 20. Got it? Now if on the other hand I were to, instead of giving you back your $20 bill, I were to give you instead a $100 trillion bill. Again, who's getting the better deal? Depends on what dollar we're talking about. In this case, I'm talking about the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, and this is a true $100 trillion bill. That's enough to pay off our entire national debt and future obligations to Social Security, and what's it worth? When this was in circulation, if you spent it quickly, you might be able to get a loaf of bread for it. For $100 trillion, it's currently out of circulation, but on eBay you can pick them up for about $2 or $3 US. Which one's worth more? 1 is greater than 20, and 20 is greater than 100 trillion. In fact, 1 is greater than both of these combined. Kind of confusing, isn't it? And you wonder why our children can't do math when you say that 1 is greater than 20 and 20 is greater than 100 trillion. But this just shows the difference in amount of money in circulation. They overprinted the Zimbabwe money and it became worthless, very much like the continental dollar. Now, to actually get into the Constitution, as we go to Article 1, Section 8, let's read a little bit about what the Constitution says about money. Article 1, Section 8, and under Section 8 we'll go to Clause 5. Clause 5 starts off with to coin money. Now it should be noted, every one of the clauses in Article 1, Section 8 start with to do this and to do that, except the first one says the Congress shall have power to. So just remember to insert the Congress shall have power to in front of each of these additional phrases. So Clause 5 should read, the Congress shall have power to coin money. You see that there? It also says to regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin and fix the standard of weights and measures. Let's go ahead and take these in reverse. The last one first. Congress has the power to fix the standard of weights and measures. That one's very uncontroversial. Very simply, Congress sets up a standard of trade so that 50 pounds of wheat from one state is the same quantity as 50 pounds of wheat from another, and so on, that we'll have across our entire country uniform measurements for trade. Very simple. This next one, Congress has the power to regulate the value of foreign coin. I find this one kind of curious. Does Congress have the power to tell France what their coinage is supposed to be? Well, of course not. So what can they do? Congress can look around the world to other coin, such as this one. This is what's known as the Spanish pieces of 8. And notice how it's been divided in half and fourths and eighths. Congress can look around the world and find good gold and silver coin that they find is of consistent content and purity, and they can integrate it into our currency. And they did that with the Spanish pieces of 8, also known as the Spanish mill dollar. This Spanish coin was the Spanish dollar. That's where we got our dollar from, actually. They said, with the Coinage Act of 1792, that a US dollar is equal to the Spanish dollar, which they later determined was, by gathering a bunch of Spanish dollars together, They melted them down, determined what the content of silver was in a Spanish dollar, and said it has 371.25 grains of fine silver. The Coinage Act of 1792 defined a US dollar as 371.25 grains of fine silver, derived from the Spanish coin, which was already in circulation in the United States. So that's the power over foreign coin. We can integrate that coin into our circulation. And by the way, some of the phrases that we're still familiar with come from that as well, such as, here we have the Spanish pieces of 8 divided in half, fourths, and eighths. 2/8, right here, this quarter, is also known as 2 bits. You've all heard of 2 bits being a monetary term. That comes from the Spanish pieces of 8, which was often broken into halves, fourths, and eighths to make it more divisible, if you want to make small change out of your dollar. Very interesting. Now the next part, Congress having the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof. The regulating the value thereof, again in the Coinage Act of 1792, Congress said that a US dollar is equal to this much, 371.25 grains of fine silver, and that a US silver dollar shall consist of that much silver alloyed with a certain percentage of copper. And that the gold coins would be alloyed with a certain amount of silver and a certain amount of copper. And they determined that we'd have a dollar coin and a 50-cent coin and a 25-cent coin, a quarter, and so on. So they delineated what our coinage would be. That's all under the regulate the value thereof power. Then the coin money power. Congress shall have the power to coin money. They established mints around the country to coin our money. We could bring in our gold and silver bullion, and they would turn it into official US coins. In fact, they felt that the coins and the value of the coin must be very protected. They put very stiff penalties. If any of the workers in the US Mint were caught skimping on the amount of silver put into a coin or the amount of gold put into a coin, they said that the penalty for being caught doing that, or the penalty for making fraudulent coins, if I'm a counterfeiter, for example, the penalty for both of those crimes would be death. So they took this pretty seriously. The protection of the value of our money they took very seriously, and we'll demonstrate why in a moment. But I want to focus a little bit more on this coin money phrase, because it appears twice in the Constitution. We have to read both of them side by side to properly understand it. The next one comes up in Article 1, Section 10. Section 10 of the US Constitution consists of 3 clauses. Each one of them begins with the phrase, no state shall, and then there's a list of things that states shall not do. We'll be in the first clause here. So Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1. It starts off with no state shall, and then I'm skipping over to 2 lines later. You'll see where it says coin money. That's the only part we have time to go into is that line. No state shall coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. First one first. No state shall coin money. Congress shall have power to coin money. I think that's pretty clear, isn't it? Who can coin money? Well, Congress. No state can coin money, only Congress can coin money. Very clear. Not a lot of confusion there. The next one says that no state shall emit bills of credit or make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. Is there any state that is making nothing but gold and silver coin tender in payment of debts? No state that will accept anything but gold and silver coin. There is no state that's doing that today, is there? There's no state abiding by that clause in the Constitution. They are accepting things other than gold and silver coin. In most cases, they're accepting nothing but something other than gold and silver coin for paying of your taxes and such things. Now let's go to the middle one. Emit bills of credit. No state shall emit bills of credit. What does it say about Congress emitting bills of credit? I won't take the time to read the entire Constitution with you. It says nothing. The word emit bills of credit doesn't appear anywhere else in the Constitution. They don't have the power given to Congress. Now, they did talk about it. In 1787, they looked at the Articles of Confederation and found this line. It says, Congress should have the power to borrow money or emit bills, speaking of bills of credit, on the credit of the United States. And they decided, let's propose to adopt that line into the new Constitution. So this was brought before the floor, and they discussed this back and forth. This should be Article 1, Section 8, Clause 2. But if you look at Clause 2, you'll notice that this phrase, emit bills, is missing. They voted it down, quite strongly actually. They decided that the power to emit bills was a dangerous power. It had led to the massive inflation of the continental dollar. What is a bill of credit then? It's paper money. A bill of credit literally means that you have deposited a certain amount of gold or silver, something of true value, and you now have a receipt, a bill saying you have a certain amount of credit at the local bank. That's what a bill of credit is. And the original gold certificates and silver certificates said on them that this bill is redeemable in its face value in gold or silver. You could take your $100 gold certificate and go in and get $100 worth of gold with it. It was redeemable in gold, and therefore it was as good as gold. But because they chose to remove that clause, the power to emit bills was never given to the federal and was forbidden to the states. Now remember the 10th Amendment, where it says the power is not delegated by this Constitution to the federal government, nor prohibited by it to the states. Well, this is a power that was not given to the federal and was prohibited to the states by it. So who does that leave as having the power to emit bills of credit? The rest of the powers are reserved to the people, right? According to the 10th Amendment. So the power to emit bills is forbidden to states, never given to the federal. It is reserved to us. We, the people, can trade in whatever we want to. I can trade a bunch of eggs for a side of beef. Or for an IOU. I could write you a piece of paper saying, I owe you for this side of beef. Now that would essentially be a bill of credit there, wouldn't it? We, the people, are free to exchange in whatever we want. But the government, state, can only use gold and silver for their exchanges, and the federal can only create coin, not bills of credit. What is coin? Gold and silver. And that was it. So what is constitutional money? Gold and silver coin. And that is all. They never had the power to emit bills to create paper money. Speaking of this, in Federalist number 44, James Madison points out, the extension of the prohibition of bills of credit, paper money, must give pleasure to every citizen in proportion to his love of justice and his knowledge of the true springs of public prosperity. What he's saying is, as much as you understand where prosperity comes from, to that same degree you will love that we prohibited paper money. If you don't understand it, you might not appreciate this, but if you really know where prosperity comes from, you'll love that we prohibited paper money. Very strong statement. Now, so we did originally start out with gold and silver as our currency, as our money. And historically, it has always degraded in this manner, that people go in to deposit their gold and silver at the local bank, and the bank gives you a certificate of ownership that you own gold on deposit at that bank, known as a, now, gold certificate. Paper money, bill of credit. One of the reasons why they prohibited paper money was, even when it's backed by gold like this, it's not long before the bankers recognize that when we deposit our gold, it's more convenient just to exchange in the paper. So we tend to buy and sell with the paper and never go pick up our gold. And they become very comfortable that at least 90% of the gold that's deposited never gets touched. No one comes in to pick it up. And no one would know the difference if it's there or not. Now there's that 10% that's constantly going in and out. So we better have at least that much. That means we could put out more bills of credit than we have gold to back it. And they quickly do so and make themselves rich in the process. And that's exactly what always happens with paper money. There's never been in the history of mankind a time when we created paper money backed by gold that didn't eventually inflate by expanding the paper money to exceed the amount of gold to back it. They've never found a way to stop it. Now where we are today, we've abandoned the gold certificates even. Notice that little gold certificate seal there next to Franklin. Whereas down here we just have a Federal Reserve seal. And instead of it giving a promise that it's redeemable in gold, it just simply says this note is legal tender for all debts public and private, redeemable in nothing. That one's redeemable in 520s or $10 bills or whatever your change you want. But that's it. So to apply some terms to each of these, The top one, gold and silver coins, is commodity money. It's a commodity. It has value. Whether or not we're using it as money, it has intrinsic worth already. The second term, fiduciary money, specifically bills of credit. That is paper money backed by something. And what gives this one value? The fact that it's a promise to pay in something of real value. That's what gives the fiduciary money its value. Now this last one, which is backed by nothing but fiat. Fiat money doesn't, like I once thought, does not mean fake. Fiat means law or dictate. What gives this last one its value is a law saying that you must accept it for payment of debts. It is the law that gives it value. And other than that law that says you must accept this piece of paper as real money, what is the difference between that $100 bill and this one? Monopoly money. This one, okay, granted, that one does have a little higher quality paper and ink. If you ran both of them through the wash in your pockets, that one would probably survive and this one would be a wadded mess. So it's a little higher quality, but still, is it 100 times? No, it's not $100. It's just a piece of paper that law says we must accept. That's it. Now, if you've ever played the game of Monopoly, you understand that during the game of Monopoly, the laws or rules of the game of Monopoly give this $100 bill real value, doesn't it? As long as you're playing the game of Monopoly, the rules or laws of the game give this real value. Therefore, this is also fiat money, isn't it? Based on the laws of the game, a Monopoly dollar has real value. And once you're done playing Monopoly, the game is over, then this reverts back to just being a piece of paper, and that's it. Exactly the same as when the Federal Reserve game is over, that $100 bill will have no real value either. It'll revert back to its intrinsic value, which is just a piece of paper. And that's it. So really, there is very little difference between the two. And interestingly, this one is monopoly money, and that one is monopoly money as well. The Federal Reserve has a monopoly on our monetary system. We'll get into in a few minutes the dangers of a money monopoly. But first, where do we go off course? Clearly, what we're doing today is not constitutional money. We are not following the Constitution. There is no state in the Union that's accepting only gold and silver coin. Congress is not coining money for us in gold and silver for us to have a money supply. We're clearly off course. Now, Chief Justice John Marshall is often looked at as this great conservative Chief Justice. He really wasn't. He did get a few things right once in a while, but he also did many things that were damaging to a proper interpretation of the Constitution. But here to start off with, he says, among the enumerated powers, we do not find that of establishing a bank, a central national banking system. Is he right? He's right. There is no enumerated power in the Constitution giving the federal government power to establish a national banking system. He's exactly right. But then he goes on to counter himself in a way by saying that because it does not expressly prohibit one, we can go ahead and do it anyway, because it didn't say we couldn't. Remember back to lecture 2 when we talked about enumerated powers, and I used the example of the automobile. You take your car into the auto shop, they do all kinds of work on it that you didn't authorize, and you say, what gave you the idea you could do that? And they said, you didn't say we couldn't. That doesn't work, does it? They don't have to expressly prohibit powers to the federal government. If it's not granted, they cannot do it. Just to reemphasize that point. Now, fast forward a little bit. What they did do is establish a Bank of the United States under Alexander Hamilton. He pushed for that. It eventually lost its charter. Congress did not renew it. But eventually they did reestablish the second Bank of the United States. The second Bank of the United States had its charter come up for renewal during the term of presidency of President Andrew Jackson. And Congress passed it, passed the renewal of the charter, and Andrew Jackson stood firmly against renewing the charter of this national bank. He felt they were a terrible threat to our prosperity and our liberty. In fact, he gave a speech that I can't help but share just a little bit of it. Speaking against this renewal, he says, "Gentlemen, I too have been a close observer of the doings of the Bank of the United States. I have had men watching you for a long time, and I am convinced that you have used the funds of the bank," meaning our national money, to speculate in the breadstuffs of the country. They're using our money for their own personal investments. It gets better. He says, when you won, you divided the profits amongst yourselves. But when you lost, you charged it to the bank, which then charges it to we the people. You tell me that if I take the deposits of the bank and annul its charter, I shall ruin 10,000 families. That may be true, gentlemen, but that is your sin. Should I let you go on, you will ruin 50,000 families, and that would be my sin. You are a den of vipers and thieves, and I have determined to rout you out, and by the eternal, and he pounds his fist down, I will rout you out. You can just feel the fire in that speech. I'd love to have someone leading our country with that kind of passion for overturning such evil powers. And so he went on to veto the renewal of the charter of the second bank in the United States. This is a political cartoon from that day depicting him taking on this den of vipers and thieves, as he called them. And perhaps one of his aides here trying to hold him back from, in his zeal, rushing headlong and getting destroyed by them. Anyway, great passion. Whether you admire Andrew Jackson or think ill of him or whatever, the one thing he wished to be remembered for, he considered the greatest achievement of his life was he shut down the second bank of the United States. I would agree with him. That was the greatest accomplishment of his life. So we fast forward now. We've got to establish a bank again, right? We come up to 1913 with yet another attempt at a central banking system. And one of the promises, one of the campaign propaganda of why it was so essential that we must have a central banking system was this. This is a chart of 250 years of history of inflation, starting in 1665 on the far end there. And you'll notice that as we get up to 1776 here, there's a little blip of inflation to help fund the war. They were printing and printing those continental dollars. As we get to the War of 1812, we again went into debt for the war. But you'll notice after each one of those blips upward to pay for a war, they paid off the debts and the inflation goes back down. We get to the Civil War where Lincoln was printing his greenbacks. And again, paper money created a bunch of debt, but they did pay them back out of existence. They spent them out of circulation and paid off the debts. So each time we went into debt, and you see the inflationary curve go back down as they paid off. And we get up to 1913. There's virtually no cumulative inflation over 250 years. But because of this rampant, out of control inflation, as they would call it, we must rein in the inflation by establishing a national bank, the Federal Reserve. So let me demonstrate for you what controlled inflation looks like. There, now we have inflation perfectly under control. And that may sound like I'm teasing here, but the only question is, to whose benefit? If it were to the benefit of the American people, it would continue flat. But if it's to the benefit of those who are running the Federal Reserve, then that's what it should look like, because they are profiting from our dollar's loss. We'll describe that a little more in depth. First of all, some of you may be familiar with the famous economist John Maynard Keynes, known for Keynesian economic theory. He's a famous British socialist, Marxist, very much the opposite of a free market economist. He was in favor of government intervention into the marketplace, that we must control the markets and have all kinds of power over the markets. He strongly advocated for things like a Federal Reserve to be able to have the power to flood the market with money and retract the money at any time they wanted to control and to manipulate the markets. In his book, Economic Consequences of the Peace, published in 1920, he gives us this very startling admittance. He says, by a continuous process of inflation. Continuous process of inflation, is that what we're looking at right here? Okay, this is what he's talking about. By a continuous process of inflation, a la the Federal Reserve, by this continuous process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens in a manner that not one man in a million can diagnose. Think about what he's saying there. if you have the power of inflation in the hands of government, they can confiscate your wealth secretly in a way that not one man in a million can diagnose. I sum this up in 3 words. The power of inflation is the power to rob you blind. Isn't that right? The power to control inflation is the power to rob you blind. Now, I was sharing this with someone who had graduated as a PhD in economics a few years ago. And if you go study economics at most of our universities in the country today, you're taught Keynesian economic theory. So appropriately, this PhD of economics was a Keynesian. And I told them, I have a real problem with Keynesian economic theory. They said, oh, what's that? Keynesian economic theory must necessarily employ the power over inflation in order for it to work. And this quote clearly demonstrates the dangers of that power. As I shared this quote with them, they responded and said, oh, you're taking that quote out of context. Okay, I could be wrong. Please enlighten me. I would love to hear a different take on this, because right now I feel it's pretty bad. And the response to me was, well, that wasn't even Mr. Keynes saying it. He was quoting Lenin. John Lennon? No, Vladimir. Okay. You mean the communist? Thank you. You've made my point even better. That doesn't help your case. Lenin is telling us how powerful the power of inflation is at controlling your people. One of the key tenets of Marxism is what? The destruction of private property, the confiscation of private property and total control of it. Well, this is a vital tool in that process, isn't it? I guess it shouldn't be too surprising. John Maynard Keynes is a socialist himself, advocating principles of Marxism. But nonetheless, that is a power that I feel no man should be trusted with. Now, another prominent economist that you might be familiar with is Alan Greenspan. Back before he became involved with the Federal Reserve, he wrote very much in favor of gold and silver currency. One of those statements he says, in the absence of the gold standard, there is no way to protect savings from confiscation through inflation. Notice those last 3 words I've highlighted. He's equating inflation, confiscation through inflation. He's saying inflation is confiscation, isn't he? Well, that validates what Lenin actually had said. The power to inflate is the power to rob you blind. Second opinion. Now, as we jump into the definition of inflation itself, we've often been told inflation is rising prices. That is false. That is a symptom of inflation. Inflation is the increase of the money supply. We'll demonstrate that in just a moment. But first, another prominent free market economist, Milton Friedman, gave us this definition. He says, inflation is taxation without legislation. In other words, even without Congress raising taxes, they can continue to tax you more and more just through the back door, through inflation. Another brilliant definition of inflation comes from James Madison. Speaking before the Virginia Assembly in 1786, he declared that inflation affects property without trial by jury. Well, that one surprised me. I'd never thought of that before. But when we lose our property through inflation, a few years later, that was protected in the Fifth Amendment that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law and trial by jury. What he's saying is that inflation violates the Fifth Amendment by confiscating your property without trial by jury. Astounding. Absolutely brilliant. Okay, now for just a moment, we're going to take the room and we're going to do a little role play. I want you to all imagine that we live in an isolated island. We're totally independent of the rest of the world. We're our own little economy. And on this island, we're all farmers. We have our horse-drawn plows, and we go out and plow our field. And I'll play the role of the banker. In this community, I'm your banker, and because the farming life has its ups and downs, very benevolently of me, I've given each of you a loan for $100, just to help smooth things out. And I'm the only source of money on this island, by the way. So all money in circulation has been loaned to you from me. Now, Ryan here is a little He's a brilliant inventor. And one day he comes out before the community and displays for everyone his newest invention. He calls it a tractor. And he demonstrates for all of us that with his tractor, we can plow a week's worth of field in less than one day. Now, who wants to bid for his tractor? He puts it up for auction. And the bidding starts, 10, 20, 50, 80. No one has more than $100, so you know it's not going beyond 100, right? Let's say the bidding stops at $100. Tractor is sold. Well, before we sell the tractor, I come along, I'm again the benevolent banker, and I feel like some of you are in need of a little help. Some of the farmers on our island are a little less motivated. They don't get up at the crack of dawn, they get up at the crack of noon. And the more lazy among us are struggling appropriately and need some help. They need a bailout. Yeah, that's it. And so I give the lazy segment of our society a bailout by giving you an additional loan of, now you have $10,000 loan from me instead of $100. Those that were the hardworking only have $100, but those that are the lazy ones have $10,000. Now who gets the tractor? One of the lazier ones of society, right? What does it sell for? Potentially, it could sell all the way up to, if there's enough people bidding against each other, it could go up to and not pass $10,000. If the tractor was about to sell for $100 until I intervened, and now it sells for $10,000, what just happened to our tractor? That's 100 times more purchase price. Is the tractor capable of 100 times more work? Has our tractor changed at all? The value of our tractor didn't change. The value of our money changed. The tractor didn't go up in value, the money went down in value. Now here's a key. With that little economic bailout that I did, those of you that have $100 just lost 99% of your buying power. It's effectively as if I came into your home and stole $99 of that 100 and gave it to the lazy segment of society that got the $10,000 loan, because the value of their $10,000 came from your 100. That's inflation. That's how an economic bailout to some in society equates with a transfer of wealth from some to others. That's one way of a socialist redistribution of wealth, when we do a bailout to one specific segment of society. Brilliant, but there's one more problem in this scenario, and that is I trapped every one of you the moment you signed your loan. Let's, just for the sake of example, let's say the example of the $10,000 loan. The moment you walked out with $10,000 in your pocket from my bank, you have $11,000 owed to me with interest. Simple interest, 10% annually. We'll just keep things simple. So the moment you walked out with $10,000, you owe me $11,000. Wait a minute, there's not enough money to pay me off, is there? There's not enough money on the entire island to pay off all the debts you owe to me, because all of it has interest on top of it. Every dollar in circulation. That $20 bill we spoke about a moment ago is the same way. Every year, but that $20 bill is in circulation. We, the people of the United States, pay interest on that $20 bill to the Federal Reserve. As long as it's in circulation. They own it. We just borrowed it and we're paying interest on it. Now here's the next key. If you don't spend the $10,000, you still have it, but you owe me a payment of $1,000, right? Each year. So you pay me $1,000 year after year. How long will that last? Well, 10 years, and you're out of your $10,000. You never spent it. You're just using it up, just paying interest to me. But you still owe me $10,000. You've just spent this on interest payments. You still owe me a loan for $10,000. You have a problem. What do? Either I foreclose on you, and I take your farm for having printed some money that was worthless, or I'll be nice to you. I'll give you a second loan. So now you owe me $20,000 and you're paying me $2,000 per year payments. Well, this second loan is only going to last you 5 payments, isn't it? And 5 years later, you're out of money again. You're coming back to me saying, can I get a third loan? Sure, go ahead. We'll go up to $30,000 now. Because I first signed you on the line, you're trapped. You need to keep increasing your debt or financial collapse. And this time, $3,000 per year payments only last you 3 1/3 years. Do you notice what's happening? The fourth time you take out this loan, it'll only last you 2.5 years. The fifth time, it'll only last you 2 years. The time that that $10,000 lasts you keeps getting shorter and shorter and shorter, leading to a faster and faster increase in the amount of money in circulation. What are we doing? We're inflating, but we're not only inflating, we're increasing the speed of inflation, which is hyperinflation. You start getting to the exponential growth of the amount of money in circulation, it's hyperinflation. That is the way our national debt to the Federal Reserve works. If we don't keep raising the debt ceiling and taking on more debt from the Federal Reserve, our economy will collapse. They will take all the money out of circulation, and we'll still have not paid them off. On the other hand, if we continue down this path, it must inevitably lead to hyperinflation. That's the way our Federal Reserve System was designed. It was designed to hyperinflate. Does anyone know who this founding father was? I'm misleading you. He's not really a founding father of our nation. He's a founding father of our monetary system. This is Lord Mayer Amschel Rothschild. He's the father of the Rothschild brothers who established the Rothschild banking dynasty of Europe. He also had a major amount of influence on the establishment of our banking system, the Federal Reserve. Their family mantra was this: let us control the money of a nation, and we care not who makes its laws. Why is that? Well, this reminds me of the other golden rule. You all know the golden rule, but do you know the other golden rule? He who has the gold makes the rules. That's what he's saying here, isn't it? I don't care who runs the country. If I control the money, I control that country. Let me demonstrate one example of that. Some of you might remember the TARP bill, the Troubled Asset Relief Program that was to bail out all these banks that were collapsing, that we were told were too big to fail. And all the scare tactics of if we don't bail them out, it'll lead to financial Armageddon, and all the markets will totally collapse, and so we must bail out these banks. And anyway, whatever the case, they finally passed it. But I want to go through the details of it. First of all, it was proposed in Congress, in the House of Representatives, as a $700 billion bailout. Now, this was shocking to our nation. $700 billion in one bill proposed by Congress. There's nothing that had ever been close to that amount of money proposed in a single bill. This was huge. And it, appropriately so, led to a massive outcry by the people. They were receiving massive amounts of phone calls into Washington, D.C., as well as letters, faxes, emails, and so on. Please do not pass this TARP bill. And Congress listened. The House of Representatives shot down the $700 billion TARP bill. Hooray! And then the Senate came up with their version. They added about another $150 billion of bribes. $850 total bill, roughly. And that one passed the Senate. They sent that over to the House. The House looked at that and said, oh, that looks much better. And they passed it as well. That's how the TARP bill went, in a nutshell. But remember the first stage of that, when Congress shot down the $700 billion one in the House? When I was celebrating that it looked like the TARP bill was dead, a friend of mine sent me an email saying, you might want to check out today's report on the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis reporting website. I went there and I found this chart, and I was shocked. This is a chart reporting the amount of money in circulation as reported by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. National, though. And you see this nice gradual growth until the very week that Congress said no to the TARP bill, suddenly they created $900 billion new dollars. Looks a little suspicious. Very similar to the amount that was finally approved by Congress a few weeks later. Now, call me crazy, but that looks suspiciously as if the Federal Reserve was moving forward with the TARP bill even before it had passed Congress. Now, that may have seemed crazy at the time, but I have proof now. Let's first start into where the TARP bill money was spent. Remember, it passed as $850 billion. And as we start digging into where some of that money has gone, we find BNP Paribas, a bank out of France, received $175 billion of it. That's a massive amount of money of our $850 to go across to foreign shores. And the next one on the list, Bank of Scotland, yet another foreign bank, getting $181 billion. Lehman Brothers, hey, at least they're local, right? $183 billion. Unfortunately, that investment, they still went bankrupt. Good investment there. The next one we find on the list is another foreign bank, $262 billion. Another Switzerland bank, 287. Deutsche Bank in Germany, 354. And JP Morgan Chase getting 391. If your math is quick, you're starting to notice we're already running out of money, but they keep going. Royal Bank of Scotland gets 541 billion. Goldman Sachs themselves got almost the entire bill of 814. Bear Stearns, 853, they exceeded the amount allowed by Congress. Barclays got 868. Bank of America, 1.34 trillion now with a T. And Merrill Lynch, 1.95. Morgan Stanley, 2.04 trillion. And our final biggest recipient, Citigroup, at $2.5 trillion of an $850 billion TARP bill. Something's wrong here. In fact, the total comes out to over 16 trillion. And the subtle little detail I didn't tell you is not one penny of this is the actual 850 allowed by TARP. All of this is in addition to the 850 billion authorized by TARP. This is what the Federal Reserve decided to do on their own under the table. The only reason we know this is that for years, Congressman Ron Paul has been pushing for an audit of the Federal Reserve. Finally, they passed an audit bill. It was terribly watered down from his original bill, and it ended up being only a partial audit. But from a partial audit, we have uncovered the greatest financial crime in the history of mankind, the handing of our US dollars, mostly to foreign banks, in an amount larger than our entire national debt. Now, this was published in our magazine's website, thenewamerican.com, July of 2011. It was a report on the government accountability audit of the Federal Reserve. And how many of you saw this in the mainstream news? They never touched it. In fact, after I saw it on our magazine website, I searched the internet and I found probably 2 or 3 other places anywhere on the internet that even mentioned it. This is the greatest financial crime in the history of the world, the biggest news of the century, and it got no press. Now that should be a clue that if the media you're listening to didn't cover this, they probably didn't want you to know. And you should probably be a little suspect of their motives. Just a side note. Now, the next thing I want to point out, here's the article that came out in our magazine's website. The title is Fed Audit, Trillions for Foreign Banks, as we pointed out, and Conflicts of Interests. The conflicts of interest part they point to is, right here at the bottom it says, for example, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, which on this previous slide received $391 billion, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase was on the Federal Reserve Board voting for it. He voted for himself to get this bailout. Does that sound like a conflict of interest to you? If ever there was one, that was one. Anyway, so they discovered that starting in the end of 2007, the Federal Reserve, over the period of 2.5 years, had provided over 16 trillion in secret bailouts. And since this article was published, they've continued to uncover trillions more. We don't know the total anymore. Shocking power. It really comes down to this statement by John McManus, president of the John Birch Society. He's well known for very concise statements that are full of meaning. Here's one of his best ones. He says, when you give someone the power to inflate, he will. It's really that simple. There has never been, in the history of mankind, someone entrusted with this power to print money, power of inflation, that did not abuse it. We've never found a way to restrain that from happening. Well, then logically, the only simple solution is don't give that power to anyone. No one should have the power to inflate. Now, I want to go to a little definition of what is the Federal Reserve. There have been many myths perpetrated throughout the history of the Federal Reserve on what they really are. They're really a fourth branch of the federal government. Well, as I look through the U.S. Constitution, I find Article 1, Congress, Article 2, the executive branch, President, Article 3, Judiciary. There is no fourth branch established by the Constitution, so it couldn't be that. They've even perpetrated the myth that they're really a branch of the executive department. That's what they are. However, a few years ago, Bloomberg Press was under the Freedom of Information Act, wanting to find out where some of the Federal Reserve money had been spent. And they went to court over it, and here's some of the defense of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York Board of Governors is the steering portion of the entire Federal Reserve. That's the head, you could say. And in an attempt to avoid transparency, saying that we are not subject to Freedom of Information Act requests because we're not a government agency, they start to tell us the very contrary to what they've always said. For example, they say that the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is not an establishment of the executive branch, contrary to what we've been telling you up till now, because it's a corporation whose stock is privately held.
By the bankers.
By the bankers, such as the CEO of JP Morgan Chase being on the board, and anyway, conflict of interest there. He also points out that it is overseen by a board of directors, the majority of whom are privately appointed. Only the chairman, Ben Bernanke, Alan Greenspan, or whoever else, has anything to do with the president selecting and influencing who that will be. But for the most part, it is run by them in their own control, by those who are the stockholders. And none of the stock of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is government owned. It is a private corporation for profit, and every dollar we have ever borrowed from them, we pay them interest every year to a private group of people receiving this massive amount of money from us. In fact, it was during the Reagan administration when he was searching for areas where they could cut the budget and trim waste. They discovered in what was reported called the Grace Commission Report that 100% of the federal income tax collected by the IRS is spent just paying the interest on our national debt. None of it funds what the federal government does. Nothing. And the majority of that national debt is owed to the Federal Reserve. Interesting. Now, our conclusion on this slide, the Federal Reserve is not actually federal at all, and they're not even a reserve. But otherwise, the name fits perfectly. It's no wonder that Thomas Jefferson warned us. I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Now, his generation clearly understood the dangers of standing armies. They'd experienced it firsthand. This is the only thing he feared more. And you can see why. In the early 70s, there was a man who won a Nobel Prize. He was an Austrian School of Economics economist by the name of Friedrich A. Hayek. He won a Nobel Prize for proving that the major cause of our economic boom-bust cycle is our Federal Reserve flooding the market with cheap and easy money and then shutting off the spout of that free money. When they flood the market with that money, such as when they flooded the market with cheap and easy money during our dot-com boom and our real estate boom, where it was said that if you could fog a mirror, you could probably get a loan. And then shortly thereafter, they tightened things up again, and it was harder to come by, and that led to the inevitable collapse, the bust that we are now in. That is, at its very root, the cause of our current economic recession. As Mr. Hayek pointed out in his Nobel Prize-winning article, the flood of money and then the retraction of money causes the massive boom-bust cycles. Now, I point this out because Thomas Jefferson said almost exactly the same thing about 200 years before him, where he says, if the American people ever allow the private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, there's the boom cycle, then by deflation, the bust cycle, the banks and corporations that will grow up around the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. Sounds like he's predicting foreclosures as well, isn't he? And we've definitely seen that. His solution, the issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. That is the only solution. Interestingly, as we read about the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, we find that solution in there. First of all, the very first part of the Federal Reserve Act starts out with this statement that it is an act to provide for the establishment of Federal Reserve banks to furnish an elastic currency. The purpose of establishing the Federal Reserve Bank was inflation. To establish an elastic currency where we could expand and retract the supply of money at any time. For that reason, when people talk about reforming the Federal Reserve, I say it's rotten to the core. Its very foundational principle is a power that no person should be entrusted with, the power of inflation. Now, the very concluding line, Section 30, says this. Congress, writing this bill, saw some potential problems, and so they said, the right to amend, alter, or repeal this act is hereby expressly reserved. They reserved to themselves the power to shut them down. And rightly so. It is time to end the Federal Reserve. It must be done carefully, because the Federal Reserve is very much the heart of our economy. And when someone has a bad heart, you don't just remove the heart. It's a very delicate process. It must be done very carefully. But there are very wise proposals on how we can effectively hook our economy up to a life support system, per se, and remove and replace this heart of our economy with one that is more stable, one that doesn't hyperinflate eventually. And that must be based on gold and silver. We'll go into some possible discussions on that in the group discussion after the video. But for now, we'll end with that. Thank you very much for joining us today.
All right, I'm unmuting everybody. Let's see here. How did everybody like that? Let's see here. Okay. Well, that's lecture 3 of the 6-lecture series, so we're halfway done. And I am going to share with you the questions for the quiz. And if you're on social media right now watching this, you can't participate unless you've called in. And so if you do want to call in to participate, I'm going to give you the phone number real quick. The phone number is 929-205-6099. Again, that's 929-205-6099. The meeting ID number is 964-139-4137. Again, that's 964-139-4137. And if you need to see that, it's a post I made on my Facebook page and my Twitter page earlier today, so you can find that there. Anyways, we'll get started here with the quiz questions. I'm going to share that screen. Let's see here. Okay. Quiz number 3. Everybody ready? Okay. Number 1, tranquility reigns. Our public credit stands on that blank blank, which 3 years ago it would have been considered a species of blank to have foretold. Again, tranquility reigns. Our public credit stands on that blank blank, which 3 years ago it would have been considered a species of blank to have foretold. Anybody want to answer that one? Okay, the answer is high ground for the first blanks, and then madness. So it actually should read, and this is from George Washington, tranquility reigns, our public credit stands on that high ground, which 3 years ago it would have been considered a species of madness to have foretold. So that's what George Washington said July 20th, 1791. I'm going to make sure everybody here is unmuted here. Give me just a second. Okay, Andy, okay, you've unmuted. Okay. Number 2, according to the Coinage Act of 1792, a US dollar was defined as blank. Spanish, yeah, the Spanish dollar, and that was, the answer is 371.25 grains of fine silver. So that's according to the Coinage Act of 1792. A US dollar was defined as 371.25 grains of fine silver. Number 3, under the same Coinage Act, what was the penalty for counterfeiting?
Death.
Death. Yeah, death was the penalty for counterfeiting under the Coinage Act of 1792. That made sure that everybody who was at the mint for the U.S., everybody making coins they were not going to mess around. They were going to make the coins exactly as they should be. Okay, and that just goes to show, according to George Washington, money was very important. It was important to have it to where people could trust the monetary system, and that's what's so important in our American system that we've lost today. Number 4, powers delegated by the Constitution. Now, we're supposed to connect these, so if you want to help out, please do. The question is or what we're supposed to be connecting is who has the power to, and so connect all that apply. Coin money, who has the power to do that?
Congress.
Yep. Congress has the power to coin money. Who has the power to emit bills of credit? We the people have the power to emit bills of credit. Congress doesn't have that power, and the states do not have that power.
That's right.
Yep. Who has the power to establish a standard of weight and measures?
Congress.
Congress, yeah.
Yep.
And who should use nothing but gold and silver coin as legal tender?
Everybody.
Well, yeah, but the states, it's required by the Constitution that the states can only use gold and silver coin as legal tender. This is constitutional money right here. If we were to obey the U.S. Constitution, states would have to accept money in gold and silver, and they can only deliver money in gold and silver.
That's right.
Anyways, okay, we'll keep going here. That's good to know. Types of money. Okay, match all that apply or connect the ones that apply. So gold and silver, what kind of money is that?
Commodity.
Yep. Gold and silver is commodity. Paper backed by gold is fiduciary and bill of credit. It's actually both. It's fiduciary and bill of credit. So that's paper backed by gold. What's paper backed by law?
Fiat.
Yeah, it's fiat. What about chickens?
I get it. That's the people.
Yeah, commodity. Commodity.
Yeah.
Chickens are commodity. Monopoly money it's the same as paper backed by law.
Yeah.
It's fiat. And what is today's Federal Reserve note? The note that we trade with people are $5 bills, our $1 bills. What kind of money is that?
Fiat.
You're right. The Federal Reserve notes that we trade today are the same as the monopoly money, and they're the same as paper backed by law. So anyways, that's the state we're in, and that's why we're experiencing so many troubles in America. Number 6, inflation is A, you can circle all that apply. A, rising prices. B, a sign of a healthy economy.
No.
C, an increase in the amount of currency resulting in high prices. And D is theft. So which ones apply to this, to inflation? And I'll give you hints, more than one. They want us to they want us to think that inflation is rising prices. It's really not.
No.
And inflation is never a sign of a healthy economy.
Nope.
So when we go to C, inflation is an increase in the amount of currency resulting in high prices.
Yep.
And it's also D, inflation is theft. So right now in America they're printing, I think, trillions of dollars digitally, not even with cash, not even with paper. And we are experiencing right now in America today an increase in the amount of currency resulting in rising prices, and we are also experiencing theft. Okay, myth versus fact. The Federal Reserve is A, a fourth branch of government. B, a department of the executive branch. 3, an uncountable privately owned corporation. Or D, an independently run but government owned and ultimately controlled by congressional oversight. Which one is it? It's C, yeah. The Federal Reserve is an unaccountable privately owned corporation. 8, Under the TARP bill, Congress authorized $850 billion in banking industry bailouts. How much more did the Federal Reserve fund through under the table bailouts? Let me reread that, sorry. Under the TARP bill, Congress authorized $850, and this is way back when, this is like 9 years ago, or 10 years ago. But under the TARP bill, Congress authorized $850 billion in banking industry bailouts. How much more did the Federal Reserve fund through under the table bailouts? And this was described in the video. Does anybody, it was a number of trillion. Does anybody remember how many trillion? It was $16 trillion, okay? Number 9, where does the value of all that money come from? Where does the value of all that money come from that was given through the TARP bill? It's not backed by gold or silver. The answer is it is stolen from the value of everything held in US dollars, including cash circulations, savings accounts, 401k investments, life insurance policies, etc. That is where the value came from for the TARP bill. And it remains true today when they're doing this latest bailout in America. So it has not come from the gold and silver that's in reserves. We don't even know if there are gold and silver reserves right now for the Federal Reserve Bank. It's coming from the backs of the American people, and it's theft from the American people. So anyways, it is clear that if we do not change our monetary system, and it must fail, leading to economic collapse and chaos. How do we end the Fed without killing the economy in the process? Does anybody want to answer that? Okay, yeah, it is clear that if we do not change our monetary system, it must fail, leading to economic collapse and chaos. How do we end the Fed without killing the economy in the process?
They got to be gold and silver behind it.
Yeah, the key is going back to just obeying the Constitution. If states start trading in only silver and gold as they're supposed to,
yep,
people will start using gold and silver, and they'll start paying their taxes in gold and silver, and then taxes will be paid out in gold and silver. And then gold and silver will be a common commodity that's used to trade, and that's what people need to start doing to prepare for the end of the Federal Reserve Bank, because the end's going to come no matter what. But the question is what are we going to switch to? And I hope nobody has the answer of a digital currency, because all these digital currencies are not what I would call trustworthy. You know, gold and silver, both trustworthy. If I'm going to choose between the two, I'm choosing gold and silver for the future of my family and my community. Okay, that's the end of the questions for lecture 3. We're going to move on to lecture 4. If you're watching this on social media, you know, please retweet. You know, if you're watching this on Twitter, please retweet it. If you're on Facebook, please share it. You know, write a nice comment about something you're learning, if you would, if you're watching this on social media, because I want to hear from you that this is working. I know there's on the video we did this morning, there was over 1,000 people who viewed that video. And I just want to hear from you on what you think about these Constitution as a Solution workshops. This is something I'm doing today as a John Birch Society field coordinator to help educate Americans on what we need to do to take our country back. We're not going to do it by just looking at the news all day and being worried and you know, being mad at our politicians. We have to be level-headed. We have to be the ones educating Americans on what's actually going on and how we fix the problems. And that's what the John Birch Society does different than any other organization. We offer the solution. So anyways, I'm going to play the next video here. So we're going to go on to that. I'm going to mute everybody here. And we're on DVD 4, so lecture 4 right now.
Welcome to lecture number 4, Constitutional War Powers and the Enemy Within. I find this one's a particularly interesting one to me. When I was, years ago, first studying the Constitution, as I began to get to know the Constitution more in depth, I found that there were some of my political views that I held very strongly that I found were in conflict with the Constitution. And this was a great time of introspection for myself to weigh my own views and see why I believed them and how they compared with the views of the Founding Fathers. And in the end, I concluded the Founding Fathers were right and I was wrong. In fact, I want to go to this slide for just a moment. The American flag here, I want to symbolize for a moment the Pledge of Allegiance, because I believe the Pledge of Allegiance really gives us some guide into a proper attitude when we're studying the Constitution and find our views might be a little in conflict with it. That when we pledge our allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands, when we're pledging our allegiance to the republic, the first question I ask is, what republic? And the answer that I come up with is the republic that is defined by two things. It's built on the foundation of the Declaration of Independence and the principles in there. And then the structure built on that foundation is the U.S. Constitution, which defines our republic, those two documents. And so when I pledge my allegiance to the republic, I'm literally pledging my allegiance to those principles within the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. And if that's where my allegiance is, then my allegiance is not to any political party or to any political candidate or any media talk show host or other media pundit. My allegiance is first to the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. In fact, even though I'm employed by the John Birch Society, my allegiance is not to the John Birch Society. I came to them because of their adherence to those principles, not the other way around. They didn't guide me to the Constitution. I first fell in love with the principles of the Constitution, and then I've sought to work with any groups and organizations who will help reinstate the Constitution and the principles of liberty. And so if any of the groups or individuals that I've supported ever deviate from that, if I really mean my oath, pledging my allegiance to the Constitution, then I'm sticking with the Constitution. With that in mind, there's a great speech that many of you are probably familiar with by Patrick Henry, the conclusion of which you may remember, "Give me liberty or give me death." He gives us a great viewpoint, a great attitude towards this as well, where he says, "We are apt to shut our eyes against a painful truth and listen to the song of that siren until she transforms us into beasts." When something's uncomfortable, painful truth, we often don't want to know. Oftentimes people would rather, don't tell me, I don't really want to know. But then he challenges that viewpoint. Is this the part of wise men engaged in a great and arduous struggle for liberty? And then he gives his attitude, which is just the opposite. He says, "For my part, whatever anguish of spirit it may cost, I am willing to know the whole truth, to know the worst, and to provide for it." And that's certainly a far more wise position to be taking. That, go ahead, I do need to know the truth, no matter how painful it is, because we must provide for it. We must prepare for it. In the case of fighting for liberty, it's important that we understand the principles of liberty, that we can defend them, and that we can recognize those who are hostile to those principles of liberty. I found personally that some people that I had voted for and supported, as I got to understand the Constitution better, I recognized that they are not supporting the Constitution. And I kind of had to repent of some of the votes I'd made, supporting people that don't support these principles. And so by knowing the truth, it has helped me be able to provide for that knowledge, to be able to prepare and to defend liberty better. So with that basis, I want to talk about some of these principles that we're pledging our allegiance to, starting with the Declaration of Independence. You're probably familiar with the second paragraph where it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." Now the next one, the next line, which is a little less commonly known, gives us a definition for the purpose of government, And I recommend when you're interviewing someone that's running for office, ask them that question. In your view, what do you feel is the purpose of government? Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence gave us a great definition. He said that to secure these rights, these God-given unalienable rights, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. The purpose of government is to protect or to secure our God-given unalienable rights. Two questions. First of all, why are these unalienable rights? It's because of where they came from. These rights don't come from government, they come from God. And if they come from God, no earthly man or organization, no government has the authority to take these rights from us. Now, the next question is then, if government is engaged in anything besides that, are they really fulfilling their proper role of government? If government's doing something other than protecting our rights, they're probably doing something they should not be. And that's probably the simplest test I've ever heard for what is really constitutional and what is not. Is it, when it comes down to it, protecting our God-given unalienable rights, or is it doing something else? Now with that, I want to compare these core principles to the principles that the Charter of the United Nations is founded on. Now first of all, this started off with a recognition that there is a God, and that God is the grantor of our rights. Now, the Charter of the United Nations never mentions God. And when you take God out of this picture, what happens to our unalienable rights? If they don't come from God, well, they must come from government. And if they come from government, then government can take them away. And so by removing those things, these unalienable rights now become conditional rights. And the limited purpose of government now becomes unlimited. And that's exactly the philosophy that the United Nations is built upon. In fact, they have this wonderful charter called the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which talks all about how important your rights are. Except there's this little clause in there that really destroys the whole meaning. It says, rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. Think about what that's saying. Your rights cannot be exercised in any way that's contrary to our agenda. In other words, you can have your rights as long as they don't get in our way. How does that compare to unalienable? Well, it's just the opposite, isn't it? That's directly contrary to the principles that our nation was founded on in the Declaration of Independence, of having unalienable rights, and then the Constitution written to protect those unalienable rights. What this means to me is that this United Nations concept is incompatible with the principles our nation was founded upon, this republic we're pledging our allegiance to. And either we must end our membership with the United Nations, or we must give up the principles our nation was founded on. They cannot coexist for long. So next, 4 key principles. The first one actually comes from the next part of the Declaration of Independence, the very next line, the concept of delegated powers. After it says the purpose of government was to protect those God-given rights, it says then deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Who are the governed? We the people. We consent to government having certain power. Where did we give our consent to the federal government having power? Well, it's the Constitution. And again, as we've said before, if it's not on the list of delegated powers, then they don't have that power. The next concept, enumeration of powers. That's that list. There's the specific list of powers they were given. James Madison refers to this concept in Federalist number 41, where he says, for what purpose could the enumeration of particular powers be inserted if these and all others were meant to be included in the preceding general power? We didn't mean to give Congress unlimited power. We gave them specific enumeration of powers. Why did we bother enumerating them if they can do anything they want? Couple that with what Alexander Hamilton says later in the Federalist Papers. He says that this enumeration of powers would be absurd as well as useless if they could do whatever they wanted, if we had unlimited government. Third principle here is the separation of powers. Now, this is one thing I do remember learning in grade school. And that is that we have three branches of government. An executive branch, which is the president and his departments. We have the legislative branch, U.S. Congress, the House and Senate. And then we have the judicial branch, the Supreme Court and the lesser courts. And certain powers are given to each that cannot be shared or crossed between them. There are certain powers, like the power to legislate. Remember before, we talked about in Lecture 2, all legislative powers, herein granted, are vested in Congress, which means that the power to legislate, the power to write law, is only in Congress. And that the president has no real constitutional power to write law, although he does it all the time. And I'm not speaking of any specific president. Every president in my lifetime has done so. But at the same time, there's no legislative power in the judiciary. And yet, our Supreme Court creates new laws frequently. Clearly against this third principle, separation of powers. We'll cover some more concepts of separation of powers later today. The last one is the division of powers. This is that some of these powers are reserved to the people. The 10th Amendment covers that concept, that some powers are to the federal, some are to the state, and some are to the people. And so the question I ask is, whose jurisdiction is this concept? For example, the management of wolves, wildlife. Clearly, there's nowhere in the Constitution that there was an enumerated power for the federal government to control the wildlife within the states. So it's not in their jurisdiction. It could be in the states, it could be in the people, but that's up to we the people. If we delegate that power to our state, then the state might manage the wildlife, might manage the wolves. But in another state, the people could choose to not delegate it to the states, but maybe to their county, and on a county-by-county basis, they manage their wolves or other wildlife. It's a matter of jurisdiction, but clearly by the Constitution we know that it's not federal. It has nothing to do with their jurisdiction. So those are the four key principles that really are very foundational in understanding what it is we're pledging our allegiance to. I always refer to the Pledge of Allegiance as a citizen's oath of office. It's very similar to when an elected official raises their hand to the square and swears an oath of office to uphold the Constitution. Literally, when we the people pledge our allegiance to the flag and to the republic, we're doing the same thing. So, the topic at hand today, talking about constitutional war powers. First, I want to introduce you to just a few statements from the Founding Fathers that give us a feel for what was their concerns, what was on their mind as they were drafting the Constitution. Here, John Adams gives us a very concise statement. Great is the guilt of an unnecessary war. You'll see that they took great pains to make sure that our nation would not too easily go to war. That we'd only go to war when we really intended to, really needed to. Because if our nation goes to war too easily, it costs the lives and fortune of our nation and that of others when it's unnecessary to do so. Another one, this one from James Madison, he says, the means of defense against foreign danger historically have become the instruments of tyranny at home. They were very leery of having a powerful military force in the hands of this central government, the federal government as we call it. They had just been through King George using their military. Remember, they were all British citizens, so the Redcoats were our standing army. And we had just gone through our own standing army being used against our own people to enforce tyranny of King George. And so they're very leery of creating that same kind of power and giving it to the president. In fact, in the Federalist Papers, James Madison goes through this in great detail, somewhere around 25 through 29, Federalist numbers 25 through 29. He examines this problem of how do you, on the one hand, have enough military power ready to go to defend your nation against a foreign invasion at a moment's notice. And on the other hand, you don't have this powerful military at the beck and call of the president to use to enforce tyranny. It was quite a problem that they debated extensively. It's a little late. If you don't have a standing army, it's a little late to start recruiting when someone's already invading your territory. You better have them trained and ready to go. And so the solutions they came up with, I find are just brilliant, absolutely inspired. Alexander Hamilton goes on to explain some of their concerns as well. Federalist number 8. He says, safety from external danger is the most powerful director of national conduct. The violent destruction of life and property incident to war will compel nations, the most attached to liberty, to resort for repose and security to institutions which have a tendency to destroy their civil and political rights. And then his conclusion kind of sums it up. He says, to be more safe, they run the risk of being less free. So again, if we have too powerful of a military force in order to be as safe as possible, we risk going right back to where we were, with King George having that military power to enforce his tyranny. So you see the concerns they have. Now let me demonstrate to you the incredible solutions they came up with. As we turn into the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, you may recall, can be separated into two categories. The enumerated powers in Section 8, and in this version that'd be on page 17. The first portion of Article 1, Section 8 are the general welfare powers. And then as we get to Clause 10, which says to define and punish piracies, that's where we start into the common defense powers. Clauses 10 through 16. So we'll be going through most of those. We'll actually start with 11, right at the bottom of the page, page 17, where Congress has the power to declare war. I think that's pretty clear, isn't it? If it says here, Article 1, Section 8, the Congress shall have power to, and then you jump down to Clause 11, to declare war. Who can declare war? Congress. There's not really any gray area here, is there? When was the last time that Congress declared war? Well, that was World War II. Have we been involved in any wars since then? Quite a few. And yet Congress hasn't declared war once since then. How did we get into war without Congress ever declaring war? Well, it's been by circumventing the Constitution. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail here in a moment. So clearly, though, the power to declare war was given to Congress and not to the President. Since then, it's been the President taking us into war, generally referencing United Nations resolutions that he's enforcing. Looking to the United Nations for his authority. Well, the United Nations doesn't give our President authority over the Constitution. He must abide by the Constitution. That's where his oath is. James Madison, explaining this concept that war-making powers must be held in Congress and not the President, he says he felt that in no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature and not to the executive department, not to the President. In fact, Abraham Lincoln summed this up very well as he was explaining his understanding of why in the Constitutional Convention of 1787 they gave this power to Congress and not to the President. He's responding here to a letter where someone felt really the President should have the power to declare war, and he's rebuking them. He says, the provision of the Constitution giving the war-making power to Congress was dictated, as I understand it, by the following reasons. Kings had always been involving and impoverishing their people in wars, pretending generally, if not always, that the good of the people was the object. Then he goes on, this our convention understood to be the most oppressive of all kingly oppressions. Wow, that's quite an indictment. He goes on, they resolved to so frame the Constitution that no one man should hold the power of bringing this oppression upon us. But your view, he's referring back to this man that thought presidents should declare war, your view destroys the whole matter and places our president where kings have always stood. Our president is no king. And they clearly understood the tyranny. They personally had experienced the tyranny of a king having the power to declare war and execute the war. That is how King George was able to do it. They wanted to separate those powers. So clearly, power to declare war must be in the hands of Congress to deliberate, to argue back and forth whether or not it's in the best interest of our nation. Now, as we continue on to the next page here, Clause 12, top of page 18, it says Congress has the power to raise and support armies. But notice what it says next. No appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. Congress can only appropriate money for this army for up to 2 years, no longer than. They could appropriate it for 2 months or however long they want, up to 2 years. Why did they choose 2 years, by the way? Congress is a 2-year session, and they can only fund up until the next Congress convenes. And then the next Congress can vote whether or not we want to continue funding our standing army. This is clearly intended to make the army a temporary structure, that they raise the army. This isn't a maintain. Notice what it says in the next clause. Congress is to provide and maintain a navy. Very different from the way they're treating an army. The Navy is supposed to be an ongoing, maintained military force. There's no limit to the appropriation of money because we wanted to always have a Navy, whereas the Army was supposed to be temporary. And why would that be? Well, again, going back to their primary concern, a Navy is very difficult to use against your own people to enforce your tyranny. And yet a standing army is very powerful at doing such a thing. They also knew that to raise a navy takes a great deal of time. They wanted to build up their navy and have it as a defense, because a navy is primarily defensive, whereas the army could be used against your people. So now we have the problem, how do you have a powerful military to defend your nation against invasions? Because again, if it's a land invasion, our navy isn't going to help a whole lot. How do we do that? How do we have a powerful resistance against invasion and yet not have a standing army in the hands of the king, or president in this case, that could be used against us? And the solution they came up with, I found, was brilliant. The next part is they have the power to call forth the militia. That was to be our first line of defense. If we don't at that time have a standing army ready to defend the nation, the militia of each state was supposed to be trained on a regular basis. In fact, as we go on to the next part, it talks about that training, but ready to be called forth by the Congress. The next portion, it actually says, the next clause, to make rules for governing regulation of land and naval forces. Then the next one, to call forth the militia. Notice what it says for. Congress has the power to call forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. That's our first line of defense when a land invasion happens. And then the next clause, clause 16, says that Congress has the power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, those that they have called forth. But reserving to the states, respectively, the appointment of officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. So we'll break this down for a moment. Congress has the power to organize, arm. It's actually their duty to organize, arm, and discipline the militia. But the states appoint the officers and actually execute the training. The militia is generally in the hands of the states, except when called forth by Congress. Now this is an interesting power. Congress, first of all, setting the rules of training, you could call it, the disciplining, organizing, arming, and disciplining. And then at the end it says, according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. So Congress sets the standards of training for this militia, so that when they call forth the militia from Montana and Arizona and everywhere else, that we're trained to the same standards, and that we don't have 50 different calibers of rifles that we're all using, and they have to figure out, okay, these are the calibers that Arizona needs, and this is the caliber for... It becomes very complex when you have many different states pulled together into one fighting force. And so they set a standard for their training and their arming and so on, so they could easily come together as one, as a defensive force. But for the most part, the power over the militia is in the hands of the states, except when called forth. And by nature of that fact, throughout our history, there have been many times when Congress has called forth the militia and the state has said, no, we don't feel that this is a valid use of our militia. We feel you're abusing your power and we're not sending our militia. That became a check against abuse, didn't it? That Congress would have to raise an army, they don't always have one, And if they want to call forth the militia, there is someone that could intervene there. Very interesting. The power is there, but it's also has some checks against its abuse. Now, the next thing I want to go into is this militia. If you talk to the average person on the street about a militia, they'll think of what they've seen in the news media, of some rogue group up somewhere out in the countryside that got out of control. They got caught making plans for overthrowing our government or whatever else. That's not a militia. They may call themselves a militia, but that's not a true constitutional militia. A true constitutional militia is under the jurisdiction of the Congress and the state in which they reside. They answer to the two of those and are organized by them. In fact, the other answer that I often hear is, well, isn't the militia the same thing as our National Guard? And no, that's not really the case either. Let me demonstrate for you. First of all, I want to point to the Second Amendment. And those that are big gun rights advocates generally focus on the second half of the Second Amendment, that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But we miss the importance of the first half of it. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. That's why the people must be able to have the right to bear arms. A well-regulated militia is necessary to our security. Interesting. Let me demonstrate why that is so. By comparing a National Guard to a true constitutional militia, there are many things we could compare. I'll just choose three. First of all, who is the National Guard? It consists of those who choose to volunteer, to enlist. Constitutional militia historically was everyone. Everyone was required to be in their state militia. Every able-bodied man between the ages of, and then it varied from state to state what the age range was, might be 16 to 65 or whatever. Today, with men and women still serving in military purposes, it would be every person, perhaps. Every person between the ages of, 15 or 16, maybe up to 55 or 65, something like that. Every able-bodied, meaning that if someone was deemed that they didn't have the physical capacity to participate, they would be given a waiver. But otherwise, it was your duty to serve. And you could be fined for not showing up to your militia training meetings of the month. And in fact, the next one here, where are the arms stored? This is another interesting difference. When you do your service with the National Guard and then it's time to go home again, do you bring your guns home? Do you bring the tanks home? Park them in your driveway? No. They're stored by the government, aren't they? You leave them at the armory. Government keeps the control of those weapons. Whereas in the constitutional militia, you were required to keep your guns in your home, ready to go at a moment's notice. In fact, they would do inspections. That they would go around home to home and make sure that you had a certain amount of ammunition and powder ready to go in a satchel where you could grab your gun, grab the satchel, and you're out the door. And if you were found unprepared, you could be fined, that you're not armed and ready to go. Very interesting. So here we have the arms stored in the homes, that military power then being with the people. And then the last one here, can they be deployed abroad? Now remember, back a few clauses here, this should be in clause 15, it said that Congress has the power to call forth the militia for three purposes. That was to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Which one of those has to do with being deployed to Iraq? None of them. The constitutional militia cannot be called forth into foreign service. For that purpose, they would have to raise an army. And so, clearly we are deploying our National Guard abroad, so the answer to that would be yes, they can. And the constitutional militia cannot be engaged in foreign conflicts. They are a defensive force only. Now, of course, when we do raise the army, who do you raise it from? You do raise it from the general body of the people. So those that were serving in the militia could then enlist as part of the army. They'd be the same people. But the actual structure of the militia cannot be called forth abroad. Very different. Now, I want to emphasize a point here with a quote from, I don't too often quote the enemies, but Mao Zedong does give us a very good pointer here, and that is, he says, political power comes from the barrel of a gun. In this first structure, National Guard, who holds that barrel of the gun? Who controls it? Those arms are stored by the government. They're in the control of the government. In a constitutional militia, this barrel of the gun power is in the people, isn't it? That's probably the most stark difference between a constitutional militia and a National Guard. The political power of the barrel of the gun is in the people here. And if you're in a country where every person is required to be armed and trained on a regular basis with their arms, it would be foolish to invade such a country. Very much. And so you can see why that is the first line of the Second Amendment. The security of a free state is dependent upon having a well-regulated militia. It's very clear why that is now. So going back to prior to 1913, to understand how the war powers all fit together. Because certain things were changed in 1913, it changes the way our war powers work. And then we'll give you a big picture of how it all works together. So first of all, prior to the 16th and 17th Amendments and prior to the Federal Reserve, here's how our system used to work. That first of all, the people here would directly elect our U.S. Congressmen, House of Representatives. And then prior to the 17th Amendment, it was the state legislature which would select our U.S. senators. So the congressmen, the House reps, would answer to the people, the senators would answer to the state. Now very interestingly, let's say the people, like we talked about in Lecture 1, recognize, hey, we can vote ourselves money from the public treasury. We want more money. They tell their congressman, please propose a bill that gives us more benefits from the public treasury. They propose that bill, it goes over to the Senate. The Senate answers to the states. And prior to the 16th Amendment, the federal government couldn't tax the people directly. They typically did their taxing to the state, and the state would tax the people. If they wanted to raise more money, the state legislature would say, I don't know, let's check. Should we increase taxes? They say to their people. And the people say, no more taxes. And so the state legislators say to their senators, don't pass this bill because if we raise the taxes to help you fund it, the people will be upset with us. You see how this works? It makes a nice little circle that checks against the government growing too much. The people in the end have to pay for it anyway. This way we have our state legislatures that we're directly in contact with, they're closest to the people, saying we don't want you to raise our taxes. And then they kill the bill. That was a nice structure, kept federal government in check. In particular, applying this to war. If the people feel there's a significant enough threat that we need to go to war, yes, we're willing to put our lives on the line for this war declaration. And the House declares war. The Senate then, speaking to their state legislature, does the legislature feel that there's enough threat they're willing to raise taxes to fund the war? And if the state legislature supports the Senate then declares war. Only then do we get a declaration of war. Do you see how that would be more rare than the way we're doing it today with just the president saying we're going to war now? And then we're going to fund it without anyone noticing? Here's the way it works now. Now that we've passed the 16th and 17th Amendments, the federal government can tax the people directly. The people are electing both our U.S. House and U.S. Senate directly. And the taxes do come directly from us, and the state legislature is totally left out of the picture, aren't they? Now, the federal government asking the people, can we increase taxes to pay for this war? And the people say, no, we don't want any more taxes. What do they do now? They say, if we can't raise taxes, but we still want to spend the money, we just created a new thing called this Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve can just print the money, which in effect, as we covered in Lecture 3, still does take the money from the people, but in a manner that, as the quote went, not one man in a million can diagnose. You don't see this tax, it's a hidden tax, but they're still taking our money. It's just a more quiet way of taxing the people. And it's much easier to get bills through because you don't see the resistance from the people. It's much easier to go to war. I firmly believe that today, if each one of us were sent a bill on a monthly basis for our share of our war efforts, that there would be a large outcry against the war, where there isn't right now because we don't directly see that cost. So it's a good way of hiding the expense from the people so they can do it anyway. So now that's the grand big picture here. We have many different checks against going to unnecessary war put into the Constitution. The army is temporary. The militia can be called forth, but only for defensive purposes. And only when Congress declares war, both the House and the Senate, do you then feel comfortable that we have a nation united in the war effort. When our nation's united in the war effort, we never lose. We've only declared war 5 times in our history. I told you it'd be rare. Only 5 times. The War of 1812, Mexican-American War, Spanish-American War, and World War I, World War II. How do we do in those wars, by the way? We won. We won all of them, soundly. How have we done in the wars we've been involved in since then that we didn't declare? Not so well. I think there's a concept here that we're missing, that maybe if we actually go through the constitutional method of declaring war, there's some power behind it. There is. That we always win, and we win definitively, and it's a short order. You don't have these long, drawn-out wars that never seem to resolve. So with that great wisdom, I want to go to some additional great quotes. This man by the name of Hermann Göring, was one of Adolf Hitler's top men. And during the Nazi war trials, the Nuremberg war trials they called it, he made a very interesting observation. He said, of course the people don't want war. Why would some poor slob on a farm want to risk his life in a war when the best he can get out of it is to come back to his farm in one piece? Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor in Germany for that matter. That is understood. But after all, it is the leaders of a country who determine the policy, and it's always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it's a democracy, or a fascist dictatorship, or a parliament, or a communist dictatorship. You can always lead the people into war. Now, the person interviewing him from America, Dr. Gustav Gilbert here, replies to him, there is one difference. In a democracy, the people have some say in the matter through their elected representatives, and in the United States, only Congress can declare wars. Well, he's exactly right. Unfortunately, we've abandoned that principle. But Mr. Göring counters him and says, oh, that's all well and good, but voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to do the bidding of their leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they're being attacked, and then denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country. I'm afraid that as I began learning these principles, that sounded all too familiar to me. This idea of telling us we're being attacked and then denouncing the pacifists for lack of patriotism. Don't you support the troops? Well, sure, but that doesn't mean I support their misuse. Now, a little more recently, General Douglas MacArthur pointed to this very same thing happening in our day. He says, our government has kept us in a perpetual state of fear, kept us in a continuous stampede of patriotic fervor, with the cry of grave national emergency. Always there has been some terrible evil at home or some monstrous foreign power that was going to gobble us up if we did not blindly rally behind it. See, the power of war is a great way to control your own people, as well as conquering other nations. There's a great amount of liberties that are lost for the cause of war. Norman Vincent Peale summed it up rather succinctly here. He says, Americans used to roar like lions for liberty. Now we bleat like sheep for security. Very much some of the concerns that I pointed out from our founding fathers, that for the sake of security, we'd be willing to sacrifice our essential liberties. George Washington gave us a great warning on our foreign policy here. He says, the great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending to our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. What's he advocating? We should have commercial relations with foreign nations, but to be tied to them as little as possible. We shouldn't have foreign treaties and arrangements and things like that, just free trade. A very simple foreign policy. John Quincy Adams gave us another warning. America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. Our military is to be used to protect us. That's their purpose. That's what we fund them for, and that's what our lives are for. Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society, also said it quite succinctly, where he says, "What would be wrong with simply minding our own business?" I like that logic. So, this was the traditional conservative viewpoint when it came to foreign relations and foreign wars. And it continued all the way through the 1940s and 50s, and we began to see a shift as we got into the 60s and 70s. We have, for example, Senator Robert Taft, who was known as Mr. Republican and was very much a non-interventionist when it came to foreign policy, to not interfere with the affairs of other nations, but to freely trade with them. Now, as we come today to modern conservatives, we see a very different brand of conservative. George Bush, for example, here, George W., during his presidency, he signed, toward the end of his presidency, this economic bailout, this stimulus package, and a TARP bill, this trouble relief program to bail out the banks that were too big to fail. Very clearly Keynesian socialist economics, some of the topics that we covered in Lecture 3. That is not the economic theory of a free market system, nor the traditional economic theory of a conservative. He also declared in his defense, "I had to abandon free market principles in order to save the free market." It doesn't sound like he believes that free markets would work. Now, I should also point out that he wasn't trying to save the free market because we weren't working under a free market at the time. The problems that we had were caused by government intervention, and were supposed to be solved by, of course, more government intervention. Next, he expanded the Medicaid prescription drug program, which is clearly socialist welfare spending, and sent American troops to war without having Congress first declare war, circumventing the Constitution. And incidentally, in this process of going abroad to war, what was their purpose? We're spreading democracy. I think we covered pretty well in Lecture 1 the dangers of spreading democracy. It always leads to a socialist state. Is this what a conservative is? I'll tell you, this was about the time when I was beginning to understand that my political viewpoints were in conflict with principles of liberty in the Constitution. I voted for George Bush. And now I'm feeling like maybe I made a mistake. This is not a conservative constitutional viewpoint that he's putting forward. What is going on with a conservative? If he's a conservative, what am I? Because I'm clearly not that. And the problem is he's not a conservative. We're mislabeling him. He's not a liberal, but he's not a conservative. What is he? Well, there's a term that's called neoconservative. When I first heard this, I thought it was just a slur, a slander against certain political viewpoints. It's not. The neoconservative name is actually one that neoconservatives have given to themselves. And over the next few slides, I'll demonstrate to you exactly what they define themselves as. But when you consider George Bush to be a neoconservative, then all these policies fit perfectly with the definition of a neoconservative. So let's see what that is. First of all, their origins. Back in 1972, Irving Kristol, who declares himself to be the godfather, kind of the founding father of the neoconservative movement, Irving Kristol points to their history saying in 1972 the nomination of George McGovern signified that the Democratic Party was not hospitable to any degree of neoconservatism. Only a few of us drew the obvious conclusion that we would have to try to find a home in the Republican Party. But with every passing year, our numbers grew. More and more people migrated from the Democrat Party to the Republican Party because they rejected the George McGovern version of Democratic Party, which was an open embracing of the hippie movement and things of that nature. And so very much we saw a migration from the Democrat Party and an infiltration of the Republican Party, steering the Republican Party in a new direction, that of neoconservative. And again, what is a neoconservative? Irving Kristol wrote a fairly definitive book on the topic called Neoconservatism. In there he tells us, for example, we, the neoconservatives, accepted the New Deal in principle and had little affection for the kind of isolationism that then permeated American conservatism. We'll spend a moment on each of those 2 points, the New Deal and isolationism. First of all, what was the New Deal? Of course, we all know under FDR, he implemented the New Deal, this massive socialist welfare program, really. Created massive government expansion of departments, bureaus, agencies, and deepened the Great Depression of the 1930s. By any free market economist's assessment, it caused the 1930s to be this Great Depression rather than a little blip. In fact, it's an interesting comparison to compare the Great Depression of 1920s, which never happened, but had bigger causes that should have caused a Great Depression than the 1930s did. And by lack of government intervention in the 1920s, we never had that depression. Whereas the 1930s, the government intervention caused it to be much worse than it otherwise would have been. Now, the other part I want to go into is isolationism. He was referring to this isolationism that permeated the Republican Party prior to them invading it. Isolationism is having no dealings with foreign nations at all. You shut down your borders, you don't trade with them, you don't go to war, you don't do anything, you just defend yourself and you're isolated. Now, he was saying that the viewpoints in the Republican Party at that time was isolationist. Clearly not the case. They truly wanted open and free trade with foreign nations. So he was mislabeling it, trying to slander their viewpoints. But truly what the traditional Republican viewpoint was that of non-interventionism, which is very different from isolationism. It is simply staying out of the affairs and wars of other nations while openly trading with them. Now, this concept of war, concept of a just war, I want to go into just briefly. You remember John Adams, great is the guilt of an unnecessary war. The only war that's really necessary is when you're trying to defend yourself in one manner or another, which sometimes might need to be going abroad in defense to finally cut off a problem that's continuing to invade you. But nonetheless, it always must be defensive. It must be formally declared by the proper authority, which in our country is Congress declaring war constitutionally. It must have a just cause. It must be for good reasons and have a good intention of why we're going to war. It must be the last resort. John Adams' presidency, one of his greatest legacies was his avoiding of war with France. How very carefully he walked the line between the two opposing political parties, one wanting him to go to war against France and the other saying, you're not doing enough to appease them. And he walked the line very carefully between those two to avoid war. It must have limited and unchanging objectives. You don't go into war for one purpose and, hey, while we're here, let's do this and this too. That clearly violates number 3, among other things, just cause and right intention. It must be proportionate means. It means that you're not just going in to level the entire country of every living thing, but only those that are military combatants, which goes right into number 7, that non-combatants would have immunity. We don't try for civilian casualties. That would be just war. That was the traditional vision that our founding fathers had when we did need to go to war. These were the general considerations that they held. Now, contrary to that, today we have a new concept, that of preemptive war. The type of war that is not defensive, it's an act of aggression. It's a type of war that started without being attacked and without any certain expectation of being attacked. Just that they might be a threat to us, so we better go in there and conquer them before they become such. Clearly the opposite of just war. Now, going back to Irving Kristol again, he gives us a little more insight here. He says the conservative welfare state is perfectly consistent with the neoconservative perspective. What's a conservative welfare state? That seems to me to be a contradiction of terms. But again, perfectly consistent. So that gives us one of the keys to what a neoconservative is. They definitely support a welfare state, like the New Deal. And interventionist foreign policy. They don't believe in this isolationism, as he labeled it, including spreading democracy. Those are 2 key points of what a neoconservative stands for then. Socialist welfare programs at home and foreign interventionism and spreading democracy. The third point that I want to make was the most surprising to me. He says, I regard myself lucky to have been a young Trotskyite and have not one single bitter memory. He's a Trotskyite? Y'all know who Trotsky was, right? We'll go into that in just a moment. Speaking of the rise of neoconservatism, the other important influence on neoconservatives was the legacy of Trotsky. In the framework of international communism, the Trotskyites were rabid internationalists rather than realists or nationalists. Now on this note for just a moment, Y'all remember what Nazi stands for? It's for National Socialism, right? Nazis aren't the political opposite of a socialist or a communist. They're very similar in many ways. It's another form of big government. But they were National Socialists, where Trotskyites were international communists. And yet they openly point to Trotsky's international communist viewpoint as an important influence on the philosophy of neoconservatism. So Leon Trotsky, let's go into who he was. Leon Trotsky, first of all, in 1917, he had partnered with Lenin, led to the Bolshevik Revolution, which overthrew Russia and created communist Russia. So clearly he is a Marxist, a communist, and as we probably well know with Russian history, that led to a very dark time in their history. Murder of many of their own people. Thousands and thousands and thousands of their own people. Very brutal, brutal regime. But then Stalin comes along, even worse, murders millions of his own people. Leon Trotsky partnered with Stalin for a short time, and they discovered they had irreconcilable differences. Enough so that Stalin issued an extermination order on Trotsky. Trotsky had to flee the country for his life. Now, exiled by Stalin, eventually Stalin's people did catch up with Trotsky in Mexico, and he was murdered. But Trotsky, throughout his entire life, never ceased working for total government. He always was a totalitarian Marxist, just of a different style than Stalin. In particular, and with the separation between Trotsky and Stalin, it divided Marxism into two camps. So those that look to Karl Marx today typically identify with either Stalin or Trotsky as what version of Marxism they adhere to. There's a division now. Okay, so here's our three main points. Socialist welfare programs, interventionist foreign policy, including wars, spreading democracy, that word internationalist was used, and Trotsky-style Marxism defines a neoconservative. I find that astounding. Now here's a few prominent names you might recognize that helped Irving Kristol with this takeover of the Republican Party. One, William F. Buckley Jr., founder of the National Review magazine, and then also Robert Bartley, editor of the Wall Street Journal. Let's go into each of them for just a moment. First of all, William F. Buckley Jr. This book here, written by John McManus, president of the John Birch Society a number of years ago, goes into the history of William F. Buckley and his role in helping create the neoconservative movement. This book, Pied Piper for the Establishment, is an excellent understanding of both the history of neoconservatism as well as his role in it. Now in here he quotes William F. Buckley Jr. declaring, "We have got to accept big government for the duration, the instrument of a totalitarian bureaucracy within our shores, and the attendant centralization of power in Washington." Now again, does that sound conservative to you? Not very. That's very fitting with the neoconservative though. But notice the year. 2 decades before they finally founded the neoconservative movement, William F. Buckley was already a neoconservative. Now, Joseph Sobran, who worked for 21 years with William F. Buckley at National Review, finally was, as he became more and more aware of some of what was going on there at National Review, he was, as it says here, unceremoniously dismissed. He was kicked out. Now, I've enjoyed Joseph Sobran's articles through the years. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago. But he has always been a very solid conservative, not neoconservative. And much of the National Review has always been truly conservative, not neoconservative. But it was because of that fact that it positioned William F. Buckley to have the ear of true conservatives and to gradually lead them into this new conservative. That's what neoconservative means, is the new conservative, as he redefined it. Joseph Sobran, upon reading this book, William F. Buckley Jr., Pied Piper for the Establishment, he says, "John McManus has gathered together a mountain of damning but firmly documented data about William F. Buckley Jr. American conservatism's longtime intellectual leader has been a calamity for conservatism." As John McManus met with Joseph Sobran, saw he had a copy of the book, wanted him to sign it, he says, "Oh, have you read the book?" He says, "I read it twice." And he starts showing him the dog-eared pages and written in margins. He'd gone through the entire book and said to him, "If only I had known this when I was working for him." The other media personality we mentioned earlier that helped with the takeover of the Republican Party was Robert Bartley of the Wall Street Journal. And this statement, I think, pretty clearly defines his political viewpoints here. He says, Mexican President Vicente Fox suggests that NAFTA should evolve into something like the European Union with open borders. He can rest assured that there is one voice north of the Rio Grande that supports his vision, to wit, this newspaper, meaning himself. Very clearly an open borders advocate. We need to create a globalist union here. Now, the neoconservatives started an organization known as Project for the New American Century back in 1997. I find it very interesting some of the things that they openly declared were their objectives. First of all, they called for the United States to use our military power to meet global responsibilities. We could summarize that as policing the world. The next one was to strengthen its ties with its allies, very opposite of what George Washington was suggesting we should do, having as little to do with them as possible. So unnecessary entangling alliances. We should challenge regimes that are hostile to our values. Preemptive wars. And then we should also insist on political and economic freedom abroad, but the form of freedom that's supposed to be is through spreading democracy, not a true constitutional republic. And then they called for the creation of an international order. That is clearly world government globalism. These are the things that the Project for the New American Century stood for. Now, shockingly, the next one was even more surprising to me, and that is that in the year 2000, September of 2000, they declared a need for another Pearl Harbor type event that would galvanize the American people to support their ambitious plans to ensure political and economic domination of the world. In particular, they had plans for restructuring the Middle East. In the year 2000, we need a new Pearl Harbor. And coincidentally, they got their wish almost exactly 1 year later, September of 2001. Who were the signatories? Here are some of the people that signed on to the Project for New American Century. You might recognize especially the top three, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz. Other names you might recognize as well. I want to focus on the top three because we'll follow them now on what they did next. First of all, the Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz trio wanted Bush 1 to reinvade Iraq in '92 and to finish the job, to completely get rid of its leader and spread democracy. Unfortunately, Bush was not re-elected in '93, so the three formed the Project for New American Century and began petitioning Clinton to do the same thing, to invade Iraq, to topple its leader, and to create democracy. Unfortunately, Clinton was a little too busy with his personal matters. We won't go into that. And Gingrich really didn't ever sign on to this plan either. So along comes Cheney, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld, given top posts with the second Bush presidency, and they were all in positions of foreign policy. They immediately resumed urging another invasion of Iraq prior to 9/11, and finally, with the event of 9/11, they had their crisis for the people their Pearl Harbor event, we could say, for the people to back them in this move. As Rahm Emanuel says, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. They certainly put it to good use for their objectives, didn't they? Now, George W. Bush, in his presidency, as we mentioned, he selected the three, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, as topmost assistants. He obtained authorization to invade Iraq from U.S. Congress? No? Oh yes, from the United Nations. That's a little bit contrary to what the Constitution says and what we covered earlier today. Next, forcing democracy on other nations and more socialism and steady escalating indebtedness for our nation. That sums up his efforts under their guidance and direction. Now, interestingly, of these three, Donald Rumsfeld, as we have on their feature article here called Neocon Control, was awarded the Defender of the Constitution Award at CPAC back in 2011. I find that a little ironic considering he was one of the most avid in violating the Constitution. And because of the ignorance of many of those at CPAC, he was the defender of the Constitution. I don't mean to speak ill of those that voted for him in this regard, but it just shows that we're ignorant of the Constitution. Even within the conservative side of things here, we're very ignorant of the Constitution and don't recognize those within our ranks that are not one of us, that are working against the principles of liberty. And I was as guilty as anyone. I was a neocon without knowing it. I supported this big government programs, especially the war powers and things of that nature. Next, Mark Gerson. The neoconservatives have so changed conservatism that what we now identify as conservatism is largely what was once neoconservatism. And in so doing, they have defined the way vast numbers of Americans view their economy, their polity, and their society. And I must say that did describe me as well, before I began understanding what we're covering today. Samuel Francis, he also points out the whole concept of conservatism in America is virtually devoid of meaning, in large part because conservatives have made the seminal error of allowing dilettantes like Mr. Buckley to define it for them in the first place. We've allowed him to redefine what a conservative is. Now, prominent neoconservatives that are also members of the Council on Foreign Relations. You might recognize a few of these faces or names. In particular, Dick Cheney, prominent neoconservative, Council on Foreign Relations member. Charles Krauthammer is one I've seen on Fox News a lot lately. He is a common commentator, I guess you could say. Newt Gingrich, wasn't he running for political office somehow recently? Oh yeah, president. And John McCain in the last round running for president as well. Who's Rupert Murdoch? Well, here's your little clue. You have the little logo in the background here, Fox News. He's the owner of the Fox News media empire and a Council on Foreign Relations neoconservative. Now, just to make things a little more confusing, I thought that Obama was clearly the liberal in the race. But because Obama has turned on his own statements about war in order to promote the Libyan incursion, Obama is now a born-again neocon, says William Kristol, son of Irving Kristol, the founder of neoconservatism. William Kristol is also a very prominent neoconservative. He's kind of gloating that, hey, look, Obama's joined our ranks, spreading the war front. So, just to make things a little more confusing, it seems that the two parties are almost identical, doesn't it? Carroll Quigley pointed to this as one of their objectives, that the two parties should be almost identical, so that the American people can throw the rascals out at any election without leading to any profound or extensive shifts in policy. And I'm afraid that's what we generally get at the general elections, is a choice between two very similar candidates. Quick review. We covered those 3 points of what a neoconservative stands for: socialist welfare, interventionist foreign policy, and spreading democracy. They look to Trotsky as their leader. Mostly it's Republicans that are neoconservatives, though sometimes they are still on the Democrat side of the ticket. They always claim to support the troops. I don't know. Supporting the troops by setting them off into wars that aren't for our own best interests, I'm not sure if that's supporting them. But they emphatically support war and consistently back socialist legislation. And they want the United States to remain entangled in the United Nations, despite the fact that we covered earlier that it's directly in conflict with our own founding principles. Ron Paul gives us a good concluding definition here. He says, neoconservatism is not the philosophy of free markets and a wise foreign policy. Instead, it represents big government welfare at home and a program to spread their version of American values throughout the world. Good, concise definition. So, if in the next presidential general election you have a choice between a liberal, a Stalinist on the one hand, and a Trotskyite as the conservative, who would you vote for? Not much of a choice, really, is there? And really the difference between the two is that the Stalinist tends to focus their energies more on the home front, in the welfare state. Although they do expand the warfare front a little bit, like Obama's doing. Whereas a Trotskyite puts more of their energy into the warfare front and less into the welfare front. And if you compare the last two presidents, Obama has certainly focused much more on the welfare front with his new health care law. And yes, he has expanded the war front a little bit. You look at George W. Bush. He expanded the war front tremendously, but he did increase the welfare state as well. It's a matter of degrees of what their emphasis is going to be. It's not a difference in principles and fundamentals. They're not opposites. It's just where do we want to put the emphasis? Again, the two parties are almost identical. For additional study, being that this is a very concise exposure to some of what's going on here, I highly recommend a couple things here. There's an article called Neocon Control, and then there's a book called The Shadows of Power. The Shadows of Power can be found at shopjbs.org. And then this article you can look up and just read it online. If you go to thenewamerican.com and do a search for Neocon Control, or if you even look up Neocon, you'll find Neocon Control. This article does a great job of showing where we are today, as well as the history in more depth than I have time to cover today, of the neoconservative movement, who they are, what they stand for. It's vital that we understand those who are working against freedom, so that we are not duped, like I was, into voting for those that are intent to destroy the Constitution. With that, that concludes lecture number 4. Thank you for joining us today.
All right, so we are now finished with lectures 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we will move on to the Q&A. I want to let everybody know on this call, and I'm going to unmute you. So everybody's unmuted. I want to let you know I have to cancel our 3:30 class because I have work I've got to do at my house. I've got a guy coming over to fix our washing machine. So I'm going to move the 3:30 class to 10 o'clock on Monday morning, unless somebody's terribly upset about that. Anyways, that's what I'm going to do, because I've got to be available for when this person comes in to work on the washer. So anyways, hope everybody understands that. I am going to go through the Q&A questions right now.
You're not on one of those call things, are you?
What do you mean call?
Where you have to call in for this?
Yeah,
You are? That's gonna charge us a fortune.
well, I have,
Here, let me. Okay, here we go. Give me a second here. I'm still trying to figure out how to switch this over here. Got lost here when switching.
I don't know.
Let's see here.
I think I'll be in charge.
You're being charged.
I had it pulled up here. Here, cancel that. It must have gone away. There we are. Okay. Okay, lecture 4 here. We hold, here are the questions here. You can see them on your screen. We hold these truths to be blank blank, that all men are blank blank, that they are endowed by their creator with certain blank blank. Then the purpose of government is defined, that to secure these blank, governments are instituted. So does anybody want to try to answer the first question? We hold these truths to be
self-evident,
there you go. Great job. That all men are
created equal,
and they are endowed by their creator with certain.
inalienable rights,
Then the purpose of government is defined, that to secure these
liberties,
these rights,
rights. Okay.
governments are instituted. So that's from the Declaration of Independence. Okay, number 2, this is regarding the United Nations promises to protect your rights. Rights and freedoms may blank 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 be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. That's Article 29, Clause 3 of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So here we go again. Rights and freedoms may blank 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 be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. And keep in mind, this is the agreement the United States stood up for or signed up for. It says here, rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. So that's pretty much saying that we're slaves to the United Nations. That's Article 29, Clause 3. And once again, it says rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purpose and principles of the United Nations. Okay, so we'll go to the 4 key principles of the Constitution. What blank powers equal governmental powers, equal government power comes from the consent of the governed. Which powers come from the consent of the governed? If nobody wants to guess on that, okay, the word for that's delegated. Delegated powers equal government powers come from the consent of the governed. Blank powers equal powers given are specifically listed. So which powers given are specifically listed? We learned about this during the last class, or actually the second class, the second lecture. If you remember, there were 2 different sets of these powers. I'm sorry. I was referring to the enumerated powers to Congress. There's more enumerated powers than just the ones of Congress. There's the ones enumerated to the president and to the judicial branch as well. But so enumerated powers are powers given that are specifically listed. The next one, powers that are divided between 3 branches of government. So which powers are divided between 3 branches of government? This would be separation of powers. So that's what our federal government does. It has separation of powers, and that's how we that's how the founders did it to keep our constitutional republic together. Okay, and the last one is, this is a different set of powers. Some powers are delegated to the jurisdiction of the federal government, while some are reserved to the states or to the people. And this is division of powers. And it may not sound like these are very important to remember, but these were important to our founders, that there were these different powers, these 4 key principles of the Constitution, that there were delegated powers, there were enumerated powers, there was separation of powers, and there was division of powers. And it was important to Americans, it should still be important today, how these key principles of powers are supposed to operate in our constitutional republic. Okay, the 4th one, dangers of war powers. The means of defense against foreign danger historically have become the instruments of blank at home. And this is by James Madison. So he said this, the means of defense against foreign danger historically have become instruments of
the people.
This one's tyranny.
Tyranny. Okay.
The means of defense against foreign danger historically have become the instruments of tyranny at home, which is happening today.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. The means of defending ourselves from foreign dangers are what become tyranny at home, and we've been experiencing that my whole life. That's what we've experienced in America because our Congress has not obeyed the U.S. Constitution. Okay, number 5, declaring war. In no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the blank and not to the blank department. This is by James Madison. In no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislative, that's the answer there, and not to the executive department.
Right.
And that's because we don't have a president that can declare war constitutionally. It has to be done by the legislative department. And if you remember, there were 5 wars that we've actually declared, and all of them have been won when our Congress has declared them constitutionally. Number 6, what is the longest duration that Congress can fund a standing army?
2 years.
Yes, 2 years. That's the longest that Congress can fund a standing army. If we need it longer, what does Congress have to do next? It just has to fund it
Revote.
for revote for another 2 years. That's the constitutional remedy for the situation we're in. Comparing the National Guard to a constitutional militia. National Guard. Who becomes part of the National Guard?
The people.
Yeah, the few
The
who
citizens.
enlist. Who
The
stores the
enlisted,
who stores the arms?
The constitutional militia.
Well, the government stores them for the National Guard, and can they be
Okay.
deployed abroad?
The National Guard can, yes.
Yeah, it can be deployed abroad, and so that's why it's so important that we remind people that we should have a constitutional militia at this time. And anyways, the constitutional militia, who can join that?
Oh, that's anybody. That's us, the citizens.
Anybody who's able. And where are the arms stored?
With the militia.
At our homes, at our
Yeah.
own. It's within
got it.
our own confines, really. The government does not store our weapons. And can the constitutional militia be deployed abroad?
No, only if they
No.
join the National Guard.
Yeah. So anyways, name the 2 amendments and the Act of Congress, all from 1913, which dramatically changed constitutional limits on out of control governmental growth. Name the 2 amendments and the Act of Congress, all from 1913, which dramatically changed constitutional limits on out of control governmental growth.
Can't do it. Don't know.
16th and 17th Amendments are the 2 amendments, and then the Federal Reserve Act of 1913.
Okay.
Number 9, list at least 3 traits of neoconservatism.
Big
They-
government. War.
Big government, yeah.
George Bush.
Yeah, they support welfare programs, they
Yeah.
spread democracies, and they're followers of Trotsky.
Oh, that's right.
There's
Yep.
3 of them, but there's more, but those are 3 main ones. 10, in September 2000, 1 year before the 9/11 attacks, Project of the New American Century, PNAC, expressed the need for a blank type event.
Oh, geez, we just heard that.
It's an attack on us is basically what they
Yeah,
expressed the need for, which is a Pearl Harbor attack, a
That's
Pearl
right,
Harbor
Pearl-
type event.
it was 9/11.
This was just before 9/11. Imagine that. 11, name at least 3 prominent members. I'm sorry, name at least 3 prominent members of PNAC.
William F. Buckley.
No, I don't think. Yeah, he'd passed away by that time. And
Okay.
PNAC, just so you know, this is an older video, so it's no longer. These people are probably no longer part of the Project for New American Century. In fact, I don't even know if PNAC still exists. I'm going to have to do some research here. But we know Dick Cheney was on it, Donald Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz. Those are
that's
3
right. Yep.
prominent
Yep.
members that were on that. Okay. Okay, the other important influences on neoconservatives was the legacy of Trotsky. In the framework of international communism, the Trotskyites were rabid internationalists rather than realists or nationalists. And this is said by John Judas in 1995. And this is
Right.
not a question here, but what is the difference between between Trotskyism and Stalinism, and what do they have in common? And this is important because this is the difference between the neocons, the George W. Bush neocons and the Stalinist Marxists. The main difference is that the Trotskyites want us to vote ourselves into socialism, so we give into it without a war,
Okay.
without standing up for ourselves. And the Marxist Stalinists, they just want to do it at gunpoint. But what happened was they realized they couldn't take over America by doing it at gunpoint. They had to do it the Trotsky way, which is pushing us into socialism and to where we're actually cheering on socialism during the process. And there never has to be a war to have us give into socialism. That's what do they all have in common? Trotskyism, Stalinism, they all have socialism in common, and that's where we are in America. And we'll learn more about that on Monday at 10. I just can't do the 3:30, and this one went on longer than I expected. So I can't do the third. Is that okay with you, Peggy, if we do
That's
this
fine.
on Monday
Yep,
at 10? Okay.
What a
And maybe
great
everybody
thing
can-
this is.
Yeah, and this is really can be used by anybody. Anybody can use it to teach it to their friends and family members. You can go online and use it the same way I have. And so during this time, especially, we should be really using this tool to teach others on how we're going to rein. If we are to rein in the government again, this is how you do it. We ourselves, as Americans, have to understand the Constitution ourselves. And that's the only way we're going to get America back is if we do this ourselves. So anyways, everybody who's on here, thank you for joining.
Thanks
And
for doing this.
Yeah, and
Thank you.
Andy, I just noticed I muted you. I'm very sorry, Andy. So everything that you just said the last few minutes, I've not, and I apologize for that. But Andy, thanks for joining us. And Monday at 10 o'clock, we'll continue these. And that's just because I've got something else going on that I didn't expect, and I need to do that. So anyways, bye, Peggy, bye, Andy, and bye, everybody else that's on this call. And
Bye.
everybody watching this on Facebook, feel free to join us at 10 o'clock on Monday morning.
Okay.
Thanks, Evan.